"Don't run," Marcus said under his breath, the words barely louder than the drip of water from the rusted fire escape above them. But Malik heard it clearly and slowed his step just enough for the moment to stretch as 10 figures shifted at the mouth of the alley, their silhouettes cutting off the glow of the street like a closing door, the neon sign from a liquor store flickering red and blue against wet brick, painting everything in pulses that felt almost like a heartbeat. And for a second, the city noise beyond the alley seemed to disappear, replaced by the soft scrape of boots on damp concrete and the low murmur of voices that carried more intent than volume. Marcus's shoulders stayed loose, hands at his sides, breathing steady, not the way someone cornered should breathe, not rushed, not shallow, just measured, controlled, like he had already counted the distance to every exit even though there was only one and it was now blocked. Malik glanced sideways, catching the reflection of his brother's face in a shallow puddle, calm, almost distant, and that was enough. That was always enough, because Marcus never looked like that unless he already knew something no one else in the room did. "You boys lost," one of the men called out, stepping forward just enough for the light to catch his grin, wide and careless, the kind that assumed control without needing to prove it. Another voice laughed from behind him, deeper, slower. "Nah, they just took a wrong turn." And the group shifted closer, not rushing, not lunging, just tightening, like a net being pulled in inch by inch. Marcus tilted his head slightly, eyes scanning not faces but hands, posture, weight distribution, small tells that most people missed, one man favoring his left leg, another tapping fingers against his thigh. Impatient, someone else glancing over his shoulder every few seconds like he expected something or someone to interrupt. Marcus noticed all of it and filed it away without a word. Malik exhaled softly, the air fogging faintly in the cool night. "Not yet," Marcus murmured again, quieter this time, almost lost in the hum of a distant car passing at the end of the block. Malik's jaw tightened for half a second before relaxing, trusting the timing even if every instinct said move, respond, do something. But they didn't. They stood there as the circle closed tighter. A hand brushed Malik's shoulder, not hard, just enough to test, to provoke, to see if he'd react. He didn't. His gaze stayed forward, steady, unreadable. The neon light flickered again, then steadied. And in that brief flash Marcus caught the glint of metal somewhere in the group. Not raised, not yet, but present. A detail that shifted the weight of the moment just enough to matter. "You got about 30 seconds to figure out how this goes," the first man said, his voice lower now, more serious, the laughter behind him fading into a quiet tension that settled over the alley like a second layer of air. Marcus finally looked directly at him, not defiant, not aggressive, just certain, the kind of look that didn't match the situation at all. And that mismatch hung there, subtle but real, like a note slightly out of tune. "You sure about that?" Marcus asked calmly, and for the briefest moment, just a flicker, something shifted in the man's expression, not fear, not yet, just uncertainty, like a thought he couldn't quite place. Malik shifted his weight half an inch, barely noticeable, his hand brushing the inside of his jacket for a fraction of a second before falling back to his side. The alley felt smaller now, tighter, the air heavier, and somewhere far off, so faint it could have been mistaken for the wind, a siren began to rise. Distant, growing, not urgent yet, just present, like a clock starting to tick. The siren grew louder, still distant but no longer ignorable, threading its way through the tight silence like a warning no one in the alley could quite place. And Marcus heard the subtle shift before he saw it, the way one of the men at the edge glanced back toward the street, just for a second, just enough to confirm that the sound had reached them too. And that second mattered. Marcus's eyes moved without turning his head, tracking the change in posture, the hesitation creeping into shoulders that had been so sure moments ago. "You hear that?" someone muttered from the back, low and uncertain, and Derek snapped his attention toward the voice before quickly pulling it back, trying to hold control, trying to keep the moment from slipping. But control was already thinning. Marcus could feel it, like tension in a wire starting to fray. Malik shifted his stance slightly, not defensive, not aggressive, just ready, his breathing still even, but his focus sharper now, locked in. The faint reflection of the flashing neon catching in his eyes. "Clock is ticking," Marcus said quietly. Not as a threat, but as a statement. and it landed differently this time. Not ignored, not laughed off. It lingered. Derek took a step closer, closing the distance until there was barely 3 feet between them. Close enough to test, close enough to reassert presence. "You think you are in a position to give warnings?" he asked, his voice controlled but tighter than before, and Marcus did not answer right away. He let the silence stretch just long enough to make the question feel heavier than it should have. Then he exhaled slowly, his gaze steady. "I think you are in a position to listen," he replied, calm, almost casual, and that calmness did more than any raised voice could have done. It disrupted the rhythm. It forced everyone to recalibrate. Malik's fingers brushed his jacket again. Quick, precise, unseen by most, but not by Marcus, who gave the slightest nod, barely perceptible, confirmation, timing aligning. The siren now closer, louder, echoing faintly off the buildings beyond. The alley, bouncing into the space in uneven waves. One of the men shifted backward half a step, then caught himself, embarrassed by the instinct. "It is just passing by," another said, trying to steady the group, but his voice lacked conviction. Marcus noticed that too. Every crack, every flicker of doubt, and he let it build, did not rush it, did not break it, because this moment, this exact moment, was the turning point. Malik finally spoke, his voice low, measured. "You ever get that feeling," he said, eyes scanning the group, "like you missed something important?" And the question hung there, strange, out of place, but impossible to ignore. Derek frowned slightly, trying to read it, trying to understand what game was being played, because it no longer felt like the one he had started. Marcus took a single step forward, not aggressive, just enough to shift the balance of space. And now he was the one closing distance, not retreating from it. "We gave you time," Marcus added, his tone unchanged, but the weight behind it unmistakable now. The siren rising again, closer still, no longer distant, no longer ignorable, and somewhere at the edge of the alley, just beyond the line of sight, a flicker of red and blue light brushed against the wet pavement, faint but real. Malik's hand paused inside his jacket for a fraction longer this time. Ready, waiting, and the alley, once tight and controlled by the 10 men who had stepped into it, began to feel like something else entirely, something they no longer fully understood, something already moving beyond them. The red and blue reflection grew stronger now, no longer a faint suggestion, but a pulse that painted the edges of the alley in shifting color. And this time everyone saw it. Not just Marcus, not just Malik. The men closest to the entrance turned their heads fully, their attention pulled away for more than a second. And that was all it took for the balance to tip. "Someone check that," Derek said sharply. But the command came a fraction too late, because uncertainty had already spread through the group like a quiet ripple. Marcus watched it happen without moving, his posture still relaxed, but his eyes sharper now, focused, present, ready. Malik slowly drew his hand out of his jacket, not rushed, not dramatic, just deliberate. And in his grip something small caught the light, metallic, unmistakable in shape even before it was fully visible. He did not raise it high, did not wave it. He simply held it where it could be seen, and that was enough. The shift was immediate. Shoulders stiffened, feet adjusted, the air changed. "You should have walked away," Malik said, his voice calm, steady, carrying more weight than any shout could. Derek's expression tightened, his confidence cracking just enough to show the doubt beneath it. "What is that supposed to mean?" he asked, but the question lacked the certainty it had moments ago. Marcus took another small step forward, closing the distance not with aggression but with presence. "It means this was never your alley tonight," he said, and as he spoke, the sirens surged, louder now, close enough that the echo bounced sharply off the brick walls, filling the narrow space with a sound that left no room for interpretation. At the far end of the alley, beyond the line of bodies, a cruiser rolled past the opening, its lights washing over the scene, in bright flashes of red and blue. And for a split second everything froze, not out of fear, but out of realization. The timing, the position, the way Marcus and Malik had not moved when they could have, had not reacted when they should have. It began to connect in a way that none of them could ignore. Malik lifted his hand slightly, just enough for the badge to catch the light clearly now, the reflection sharp against the wet pavement. "Police," he said quietly, and the word did not need volume to land. It cut clean through the noise, through the tension, through every assumption that had been made in the last few minutes. Marcus reached into his jacket as well, mirroring the motion, his own badge visible now, not presented as a threat, but as a fact, unchangeable, undeniable. Off-duty does not mean unaware, Marcus added, his tone even, but firm, and the alley seemed to shrink again, not physically, but in feeling. The space that had once belonged to the 10 men now felt like something else entirely, something controlled from the center rather than the edges. One of the men took a step back, then another, the movement subtle but contagious, the formation breaking without anyone giving the order. Derek remained still for a moment longer, his eyes moving between the badges, the lights, the brothers, trying to recalibrate, trying to regain footing in a situation that had quietly shifted beyond his control. Marcus watched him carefully, not with anger, not with triumph, but with a kind of steady patience, as if giving him one last chance to understand. "We gave you space to leave," Marcus said, softer now, almost reflective. "You chose to stay." And the sirens did not fade. This time, they grew louder, closer, filling the alley completely as another set of lights approached the entrance, the glow intensifying, washing over every face, every movement, every shadow. And in that light, the truth of the moment settled fully into place, not loud, not explosive, but absolute. The second cruiser did not rush in. It rolled to a controlled stop at the mouth of the alley, its engine low, steady, like it had been expected all along. And that detail settled heavier than the sirens ever could, because now it was not just noise. It was presence, real and undeniable. The red and blue lights washed across the wet walls in slow rotations, catching every face in sharp contrast, no shadows left to hide behind. Marcus lowered his badge slightly, but did not put it away, his posture unchanged, calm, grounded, as if the entire scene had simply reached the point he had been waiting for. Malik mirrored him, stepping half a pace forward, not to confront but to anchor the space, to make it clear where the center now was. One of the men near the back raised his hands instinctively, not high, just enough to signal uncertainty, and that movement broke whatever remained of the formation. Another stepped sideways, giving space without realizing it. The circle that had once felt tight and controlled now loosened, uneven, fragile. Derek exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening as he tried to recover some sense of authority, but the moment had already shifted too far. His eyes flicked toward the alley entrance where the cruiser lights continued to pulse, then back to Marcus, trying to measure, trying to calculate what had just happened. "You set this up," he said, not accusing, more realizing. And Marcus did not answer right away. He let the statement sit in the air, let it connect on its own, because the truth did not need to be explained, it needed to be recognized. Malik's voice came next, low and even. "We gave you every chance to walk away. And there was no edge in it, no anger, just fact. And that made it land harder." One of the men glanced at Derek, waiting for direction, but none came, because there was no direction left to give that would change what had already unfolded. The sirens began to quiet slightly as the engines idled, the urgency fading into control, into procedure, but the tension in the alley did not disappear. It shifted, became something heavier, more internal. Marcus finally stepped closer, closing the last bit of distance, not invading, just present enough that Derek could not ignore him. "You thought you were choosing the moment," Marcus said quietly, "but you walked into ours." And the words were not spoken to challenge, they were spoken to clarify, to draw the line between assumption and reality. Malik glanced briefly toward the alley entrance, a subtle check, then back to the group, his expression unchanged, steady, professional, the kind of composure that did not need to prove itself. One of the officers near the cruiser stepped out, not rushing, just observing, letting the scene settle before moving in. And that restraint mirrored the stillness Marcus and Malik had held from the beginning. Nothing rushed, nothing forced, everything deliberate. Derek's shoulders lowered slightly, the fight in his posture draining into something quieter, something closer to understanding, not agreement, not acceptance, but awareness. Marcus watched him for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, not approval, not forgiveness, just acknowledgement that the moment had reached its end. It does not always look the way you expect, Marcus added, softer now, almost reflective, and for a second the alley felt still again, not tense, not quiet, just settled. The rain continuing to fall in thin lines from the fire escape above, tapping against metal, against concrete, against the edges of a moment that had begun with control in the wrong hands and ended with it returned to where it had quietly been all along. The rain softened to a steady whisper, tracing thin lines down the brick walls as the alley settled into a strange, heavy quiet, not empty, but full of everything that had just shifted. Marcus stepped back half a pace, not retreating, just creating space as the officers near the cruisers began to move with calm precision. No rush, no raised voices, only quiet control, the kind that did not need to announce itself. Malik slipped his badge back inside his jacket, the metal catching one last flash of red and blue before disappearing, his eyes still on the group, reading the final fragments of tension that lingered in their posture. Derek stood still, his earlier confidence now replaced by something more measured, his gaze dropping briefly to the wet pavement before lifting again, slower this time, more aware. "You could have stopped it sooner," he said, not as a challenge, more like a question he was asking himself out loud. Marcus watched him for a moment, the reflection of the lights shifting across his face, then shook his head slightly. "No," he replied, his voice even. "You had to choose it first," and the words did not carry blame. They carried weight, the kind that settled in after everything else had already fallen quiet. One of the officers approached the group, speaking in a low, steady tone, guiding, not forcing, and the men responded without resistance now, their earlier edge gone, replaced by compliance that came from understanding rather than pressure. Malik glanced toward the alley entrance again, the street beyond visible now between the gaps where bodies had once blocked it, headlights passing, distant voices, life continuing just a few yards away as if nothing had happened, and that contrast lingered. How quickly a moment could exist and dissolve in the same space. Marcus turned slightly, his shoulder brushing the damp brick as he looked up for a second, watching the rain collect and fall from the metal ladder above, each drop catching the light before disappearing. Then he looked back at Derek, who had not moved far, still processing, still standing at the edge of what he thought he understood. "You saw two men in the wrong place," Marcus said quietly, "but you never asked why we were there." Derek let out a slow breath, the answer forming too late to matter. Malik stepped closer to his brother, their movements in sync without thought, the kind of alignment built over years, over moments just like this. "Most people do not," Malik added, his tone calm, almost reflective. "They decide first, then they see." The officers near the cruisers finished positioning, the scene no longer tense, just controlled, routine returning to the edges of something that had started anything but ordinary. Derek nodded once, small, almost reluctant, but real, and that was enough. Marcus did not push further, did not add anything else, because the moment had already said what it needed to. He turned toward the alley entrance, the red and blue lights now less harsh, more like a fading pulse than a warning. Malik followed beside him, their footsteps quiet against the wet concrete, steady, unhurried, and as they moved past the edge of the alley into the open street, the noise of the city returned fully, cars passing, a distant horn, the low hum of everything continuing. Marcus paused for just a second at the edge, glancing back once, not to check, not to confirm, but simply to acknowledge the space they were leaving behind. Then he stepped forward, disappearing into the flow of the street. The alley behind them no longer a trap, no longer a test, just another narrow stretch of brick and shadow holding the echo of a moment where perception failed, and truth quietly took its place. The street felt warmer than the alley, not in temperature but in movement, in sound, in the steady rhythm of people and cars that did not pause for what had just happened behind them. Marcus walked along the curb, his steps even, shoulders relaxed again as if the tension had been left exactly where it belonged. Malik matched his pace without looking at him, their silence not empty but familiar, the kind that did not need to be filled. A car passed slowly, its headlights stretching long across the wet asphalt, then fading, and for a moment the only sound was the soft hiss of tires against rain-slick pavement. "You waited longer than usual," Malik said finally, his voice low, almost blending into the city noise. Marcus glanced ahead, not slowing, not turning. They needed the time. He replied, simple, direct, as if the answer had been obvious from the start. Malik let out a quiet breath, not quite a laugh, not quite agreement, just acknowledgement. One more minute and they would not have walked away the same. He said, not as criticism, just observation. Marcus nodded. Slightly, his gaze shifting briefly toward a storefront window where their reflections moved side by side, distorted by the glass and the rain. That was the point, he answered, and the words settled between them with a weight that was not heavy, just real, a reminder that not every moment was about control. Sometimes it was about letting the moment reveal itself. They reached the corner, the traffic light casting a steady green glow across the intersection, and for a second Marcus paused, not because he had to, but because he always did, scanning, noticing, measuring the flow of everything around him. Habit, instinct, something deeper. Malik stopped beside him, hands in his jacket pockets now, posture easy, but his eyes still alert, always alert. A group of people laughed as they passed on the opposite sidewalk, unaware, untouched by the shift that had taken place just yards away, and that contrast lingered again. How invisible certain moments were to those not standing inside them. You think he understood? Malik asked after a second, not naming Derek, not needing to. Marcus watched the light change, green to yellow, then back to red, the rhythm steady, predictable. He will, Marcus said, not certain, not doubtful, just patient. And that patience carried something more than confidence. It carried experience, the kind that new understanding did not always arrive in the moment. Sometimes it followed, quiet, delayed, but lasting. Malik nodded once, accepting that, and they stepped off the curb together, crossing the street in sync, their footsteps steady against the painted lines, the city continuing around them without interruption, without pause. And yet something had shifted, not in the noise, not in the movement, but in the space they carried with them, the awareness, the clarity, the quiet weight of a moment that had begun in tension and ended in something closer to truth. Marcus adjusted his jacket slightly, the edge of his badge pressing briefly against the fabric before settling again out of sight, hidden, like it had been from the start, like it would be again, because what mattered was not what people saw first, it was what they chose to see after. Malik glanced back once, just once, toward the alley now far behind them, its entrance barely visible between buildings, already blending back into the city as if nothing had happened. Then he turned forward again, his pace unchanged, matching Marcus step for step, and together they moved on, not looking for the next moment, not chasing it, just ready for it when it came, because it always did, in places just like that, at times just like this, where assumption met reality and the outcome depended on who understood the difference first. The crosswalk signal clicked softly as it changed, the faint mechanical sound barely noticeable beneath the hum of traffic. But Marcus heard it. He always did. Small details, small shifts, the kind that most people filtered out without realizing it. And as they reached the other side of the street, he slowed just slightly, enough to let a delivery truck roll past before continuing. Malik adjusted his pace with him without thinking, their movement still aligned, still quiet. You ever think about how fast it flips? Malik said after a moment, his voice low, thoughtful now, less about the alley, more about everything around it. Marcus glanced ahead, watching a man lock up a corner store, the metal gate rattling as it slid down. It does not flip, Marcus replied calmly. It reveals. And that distinction hung there, subtle but important, because what had happened back there had not changed anything about who they were or what they carried. It had only changed what others finally saw. Malik nodded slowly, considering that, his gaze drifting briefly to a passing car where a driver glanced at them and then looked away, uninterested, unaware, just another moment moving past. Most people never get to the reveal, Malik said, almost to himself, and Marcus did not disagree, because that was the truth. Most moments ended before they ever reached that point, before the silence broke in the right way, before the weight shifted enough to matter. They kept walking, turning down another block where the lights were dimmer, the buildings older, the rhythm of the city softer but still constant. A flickering street lamp cast uneven light across the sidewalk, stretching their shadows long and thin behind them. And for a second those shadows moved ahead of them instead, leading rather than following. A quiet reversal that Marcus noticed but did not comment on. "You saw the guy on the left," Malik said after a beat, bringing the focus back. He was the one watching the street. Marcus nodded once. "He was waiting for something to interrupt," he replied. But he did not know what. Malik let out a soft breath. "None of them did," he added. And that was the core of it. The uncertainty that had been there from the start, hidden beneath confidence, beneath numbers, beneath the assumption that control belonged to whoever claimed it first. Marcus slowed again near a bus stop, glancing at the schedule posted behind the glass, not because he needed it, but because habit kept him grounded in ordinary actions, in normalcy. Even after moments that were anything but, Malik leaned lightly against the metal bench, his posture relaxed now, but his eyes still scanning the street. Always scanning. A bus approached in the distance, its headlights cutting through the light rain, growing brighter with each second. "You think they will remember this?" Malik asked, not with doubt, but with curiosity. Marcus watched the bus draw closer, its engine low, steady, predictable. "They will remember the feeling," he said, "even if they forget the details," and that mattered more, because details faded. But the shift, the moment where certainty broke and something else took its place, that stayed. The bus pulled up with a soft hiss, doors opening, a few passengers stepping off, none of them paying attention to the two men standing just feet away, none of them knowing what had just unfolded a block over. And Marcus appreciated that, the separation, the way life continued without needing to understand every moment that existed within it. Malik straightened, pushing off the bench. "So what now?" he asked, not because he did not know, but because the question itself was part of the rhythm. Marcus stepped forward again, falling back into motion. "Now we keep walking," he said simply, and there was something steady in that answer, something grounded, because the work was not in the moments that stood out. It was in everything that came after, in the way they carried those moments forward without letting them define every step. Malik fell in beside him, their pace matching once more, and as they moved down the dimly lit street, the city stretched out ahead, full of unknowns, full of assumptions waiting to be tested, full of moments that had not yet revealed themselves. And they did not chase them, they did not search for them, they just moved forward, ready, aware, and patient enough to let the next moment come to them when it was ready. The street narrowed as they moved farther from the main avenue, the glow of storefronts fading into scattered pools of light beneath aging lamps, each one buzzing faintly like it was struggling to stay awake. Marcus adjusted his pace again, slower now, not because he was tired, but because something in the air had shifted, subtle, almost invisible, but present enough to notice if you were paying attention. Malik felt it too, his steps softening just slightly, his eyes moving not just forward, but to the edges, to reflections in dark windows, to the rhythm of footsteps that were not theirs. "You feel that?" Malik said quietly, not a question, more a confirmation. Marcus did not answer right away. He let the silence stretch, listening, measuring. The distant hum of traffic had thinned, replaced by a quieter layer of sound, a door closing somewhere behind them, the faint echo of voices 2 blocks over, and something else, something closer, not loud, not obvious, but out of sync with everything else. Marcus finally nodded, once small. "Yeah," he said, his voice low, steady. "It is not following, it is waiting." And that difference mattered, because following meant movement, meant intent that could be tracked, but waiting meant positioning, meant someone had already chosen where the moment would happen. Malik shifted his shoulders slightly, loosening tension without showing it, his hands still in his jacket pockets, but his posture no longer casual. "Same kind of night," he murmured, and Marcus let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like agreement, but carried something else too, recognition, familiarity. They kept walking, not stopping, not changing direction, just continuing as if nothing had changed, because sometimes the only way to understand a moment was to let it come into focus on its own. A flicker of movement caught in a window to their right, not a reflection, something behind the glass, someone standing just out of the light, still, watching. Marcus did not turn his head, did not react, but he noted it, filed it, added it to the growing pattern that was beginning to form. Malik slowed half a step, enough to fall just behind Marcus for a moment, creating a slight shift in their alignment, subtle, intentional. "You want to keep going?" Malik asked quietly, and Marcus considered it for exactly one breath before answering. "No," he said, just as calm. "We let it come to us." And there was no hesitation in that choice, no uncertainty, just a quiet decision that settled between them like a line drawn in place. They reached the end of the block where the sidewalk curved slightly around a closed diner, its neon sign half lit, casting a dull pink glow across the pavement. The rain had slowed to a mist now, barely visible except in the way it softened the light. Marcus stopped, not abruptly, just enough that the motion broke naturally, as if he had simply decided to take in the space. Malik stepped up beside him again, their shoulders nearly aligned, both of them facing forward, but aware of everything behind and around them. The city held its breath in that moment, not literally, but in the way the sound seemed to dip, to narrow, to focus, and then, just as quietly as it had begun, the presence they had felt started to reveal itself, a figure stepping slightly into the edge of the light behind them. Not close, not far, just enough to confirm what had been building all along. Marcus did not turn, did not react outwardly, but his voice came low and steady. "You can step into the light," he said, not as a command, not as a challenge, but as an invitation that carried more weight than either. And for a moment, nothing happened. The mist hung in the air, the neon flickered once, twice, and then the figure shifted again. Closer this time, just enough for shape to become form, for presence to become undeniable, and the night, which had seemed to settle after the alley, began to tighten once more, not with chaos, but with intention, quiet, controlled, and waiting for the next reveal. The figure did not rush forward, did not speak right away, just stood at the edge of the dim light where the flickering neon brushed against his outline, enough to show shape but not detail, and that hesitation said more than movement ever could. Marcus remained still, his gaze forward, but his awareness shifted fully behind him now, mapping distance, posture, breath. Malik angled his head slightly, just enough to catch the reflection in the diner window across the street, the glass warped but clear enough to confirm what they were already feeling. One person, average height, hands visible, not raised, not hidden, just uncertain. "You have been there for a while," Marcus said calmly, his voice steady, carrying across the quiet space without effort. The figure shifted again, a small step forward into the light, revealing a man in his early 30s, jacket damp from the mist, eyes moving between the two brothers like he was trying to decide whether he had already made a mistake by stepping closer. "I was not following," the man said quickly, his voice tight, defensive, but not aggressive, and Marcus nodded slightly, as if he had already expected that answer. "No," he replied. "You were waiting." And that correction landed heavier, because it removed the excuse and replaced it with intention. The man hesitated, glancing briefly down the street behind him, then back again, his shoulders tense but not confrontational. "I saw what happened back there," he said after a moment. The words coming slower now, more deliberate, and Malik's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus, because that added a layer they had not confirmed yet. "Most people kept walking," Malik said, his tone neutral, and the man let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh without humor. "Most people do not stop when they think they already understand," he replied, and that line hung there, echoing something deeper than the surface of the moment. Marcus turned slightly now, not fully, just enough that the man could see his face clearly, could read the calm in it, the absence of tension, the presence of something else entirely. "So what do you think you understand?" Marcus asked, not challenging, not testing, just asking, and the man paused, longer this time, as if realizing that whatever answer he gave would matter more than he had planned. "I think," he started, then stopped, shaking his head slightly, recalibrating. "I think you let it happen," he said finally, his voice quieter now, more certain, and Malik shifted his weight, the smallest adjustment, acknowledging the truth in that statement without confirming it outright. Marcus held the man's gaze for a second, then another, letting the silence do what words could not, and then he spoke. "We let it reveal itself," he said, the same distinction he had made earlier, the same line drawn between control and understanding. The man nodded, slowly, absorbing that, his shoulders lowering just a fraction, the tension in him shifting from fear into something closer to thought, to processing. The neon sign behind Marcus flickered again, casting a brief wash of pink across all three of them before settling back into its uneven glow. "Why?" the man asked, and this time it was not defensive, not cautious, it was genuine. A question that reached past the moment and into something larger. Malik glanced at Marcus briefly, then back to the man. "Because if we stepped in too early," Malik said calmly, "you would have seen two officers controlling a situation." He paused, just long enough for the next part to land. "But this way, you saw everything that led to it." The man stood still, the meaning settling in slowly, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just steady, like something clicking into place piece by piece. Marcus turned fully now, facing him without tension, without urgency. "And now you have a choice," Marcus added, his voice quiet but clear. "What you do with what you saw matters more than what we did." And the night held that moment, held the space between them where nothing moved and everything shifted, the mist continuing to fall, the neon humming faintly above, and somewhere in the distance, the city carried on, unaware that right here, in a quiet corner under a flickering light, another kind of understanding had just begun to take shape. The question lingered in the air longer than the mist, heavier than the quiet hum of the neon sign above them. And for a moment, no one moved. Not Marcus, not Malik, not even the man standing in the half-light, because what had just been said did not demand a quick answer, it demanded a real one. Marcus studied him carefully now, not as a threat, not even as a variable, but as someone standing at a point where understanding could either grow or disappear depending on what came next. The man shifted his weight slightly, his eyes dropping for a second before lifting again, steadier this time, more grounded. "You said I have a choice," he began slowly, the words forming with more intention than before. "But what exactly am I choosing?" Malik glanced toward Marcus briefly, then back at the man, his posture relaxed but his attention sharp, because this was no longer about control, it was about clarity, and clarity took patience. Marcus stepped forward half a step, not closing distance, in a threatening way, just enough to meet the moment fully. "You are choosing what the moment becomes after you leave it," he said quietly, and the answer did not rush. It settled, like something meant to be carried rather than reacted to. The man frowned slightly, not confused, but processing, trying to fit the words into something tangible, something he could hold on to. "You mean whether I say something?" he asked. And Marcus shook his head once, small, deliberate. "No," he replied. "I mean, whether you understand what you saw, or whether you turn it into something easier to explain." And that distinction cut deeper than anything else had so far, because it removed the simplicity. It removed the option to walk away with a clean version of events that fit comfortably into assumptions. Malik stepped slightly to the side now, his movement subtle but intentional, giving the man space to think, without pressure. "Most people choose the easier version," Malik added, his tone calm, not judgmental, just honest. "It lets them move on without changing anything." The man let out a slow breath, his shoulders lowering further, the tension in him no longer defensive, but reflective, his gaze drifting briefly toward the alley they had come from, now out of sight, but still present in his mind. "And if I do not?" he said quietly, more to himself than to them. Marcus watched him, not pushing, not guiding, just waiting, because the answer could not be given. It had to be reached. "Then, it stays with you," Marcus said after a moment. "And it changes how you see the next moment, and the one after that." The man nodded slowly, almost reluctantly, because there was weight in that. Responsibility, not imposed, but realized. The neon flickered again, the soft buzz filling the silence for a second before fading back into the background. Malik crossed his arms loosely, not closed off, just settled. "You saw 10 people who thought they were in control," Malik said, his voice steady. "And 2 who did not need to prove anything." He paused, letting that settle. "What matters is which part you remember when you think about it later." The man looked between them, his expression no longer uncertain, but thoughtful, something shifting behind his eyes. Not dramatic, not immediate, but real. Marcus gave a small nod, not approval, not conclusion, just acknowledgement that the moment had reached its point. You do not need to say anything tonight. Marcus added, softer now. Just do. Not forget what it felt like when it changed. And that was it. No instruction, no demand, just a line left in place. The man stood there for another second, then nodded once, more firmly this time. As if something inside him had settled into position, he stepped back slightly, not retreating, just creating space. And for the first time since he had appeared, he looked less like someone caught in a moment and more like someone carrying one forward. Marcus turned then, not waiting, not checking, simply moving, Malik falling into step beside him again without a word. And as they walked away from the dim glow of the diner, the city opened up ahead of them once more, unchanged on the surface, but layered now with something deeper, something quieter, something that did not need to be seen to exist, because it was already there, in the way moments unfolded, in the way people chose to understand them, and in the space between what was assumed and what was real. The city noise returned in layers as they moved farther from the diner, a low hum of engines, distant laughter, the faint clatter of something metal being dropped and picked up again, ordinary sounds that filled the space where tension had been just minutes ago. Marcus kept his pace steady, neither fast nor slow, just consistent, like the rhythm of someone who understood that what came after mattered just as much as what had already happened. Malik walked beside him, his hands still in his jacket pockets, but his gaze sharper again, scanning reflections in passing windows, reading movement in peripheral spaces that most people ignored without thinking. He is going to carry that, Malik said after a while, his voice low, almost blending into the night. Marcus nodded once without looking back. He already is, he replied, and there was something certain in that, something quiet but grounded, because the shift had already taken place, the moment had already done its work, whether the man fully understood it yet or not. They turned onto a broader street now, brighter, more open, the lights from a convenience store spilling across the sidewalk, illuminating everything in a steady white glow that left little room for shadows. And for a second the contrast felt sharp, moving from dim uncertainty into clear visibility. Marcus slowed near the edge of the light, glancing briefly inside the store where a clerk stood behind the counter, watching a small screen, unaware of anything beyond the glass. Malik followed his gaze for a second, then looked away. Funny, Malik said quietly. How most of the world keeps moving like nothing ever happens. Marcus let out a soft breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. Because most of it does not, he said. Not like that. And that distinction settled again, the difference between moments that passed and moments that stayed. They stepped back into the darker stretch of the sidewalk, leaving the bright light behind them. The shift almost immediate, the air cooler, the space quieter, and yet neither of them changed pace. Neither of them hesitated, because the environment did not define the awareness they carried. Malik tilted his head slightly, listening, not for anything specific, just confirming that the pattern around them had returned to normal. No waiting presence, no misaligned movement, just the city breathing in its usual rhythm. You think they will talk about it? Malik asked after a moment, and Marcus considered the question, not dismissing it, not answering too quickly. Some of them will, he said, but not the way it happened. Malik nodded slowly, understanding that, because stories changed when they were retold, details softened, edges blurred, and what remained was often shaped more by comfort than truth. But one of them will remember it right, Malik added, thinking of the man by the diner, and Marcus gave a slight nod. That is enough, he said, and the simplicity of that answer carried more weight than anything else, because it did not require everyone to understand, just one person choosing not to forget. They walked in silence for a few more steps, the sound of their shoes against the pavement steady, grounded, real, and then Marcus slowed again, just slightly, his gaze lifting toward the far end of the street where the lights faded into distance. Mom used to say something, he said quietly, the tone shifting, softer now, more personal than anything before. Malik glanced at him, surprised for just a second, because Marcus did not often bring the past into the present like that. She used to say that people show you who they are when they think no one is watching. Marcus continued, his voice even, but carrying something deeper beneath it. Malik looked ahead again, letting the words settle. And tonight, Malik said slowly, they thought they were. Marcus nodded once, Exactly, he replied, and the meaning stretched beyond the alley, beyond the diner, beyond the man who had stayed to watch. It reached into something broader, something quieter, the kind of truth that did not need to be spoken often to be understood. They kept walking, the city opening in front of them once more, full of movement, full of moments waiting to unfold, and neither of them rushed, neither of them searched. They simply moved forward, carrying with them the stillness, the awareness, and the quiet certainty that what mattered most was not the moment itself, but what it revealed when everything else fell away. The streetlights stretched longer shadows now as the night settled deeper, the air cooler, quieter, carrying that late-hour stillness where everything felt slower but more defined. Marcus and Malik walked side by side without speaking, their steps aligned, their presence steady, not drawing attention, not avoiding it either, just existing within the rhythm of the city like they always had. A distant train rumbled somewhere beneath the streets, its low vibration barely noticeable unless you stood still long enough to feel it. And Marcus felt it, not with his feet, but with that same awareness that had guided him all night, the kind that did not turn off when the moment passed. Malik glanced toward a row of parked cars, their windows reflecting fragmented pieces of light and movement. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place, but he checked anyway. Always checked. "You ever notice?" Malik said quietly, his voice softer now, less guarded. "How the quiet after feels louder than the moment itself?" Marcus let the thought sit for a second before answering, his gaze forward, steady. "Because the moment fills you," he said. "And when it leaves, you hear what is left behind." Malik nodded slowly, understanding that in a way that did not need explanation, because what remained was not noise, it was clarity. They passed a small park, its gate closed, benches empty, the faint rustle of leaves moving with a light breeze, and for a moment the city felt distant, like it had stepped back just enough to give space to what had unfolded. Marcus slowed near the edge of the sidewalk, looking out across the dark stretch of grass, not searching for anything, just letting the stillness settle. Malik stopped beside him, hands still in his pockets, his posture relaxed but grounded. "You think we changed anything tonight?" Malik asked, not as doubt, but as reflection. Marcus took a breath, slow, measured, the kind that came after everything had already been decided. "We did not change anything," he said. "We revealed it." And the words carried the same weight as before, the same truth that had threaded through every moment of the night. Malik looked out at the empty park, the silence stretching just enough to feel real. "That guy," Malik said after a second, "he is going to see things differently now." Marcus nodded once. "That is how it starts," he replied, not dramatic, not hopeful, just certain, because change was not loud, it was not immediate, it was quiet. It built slowly, moment by moment, understanding by understanding. They stood there for another second. Then Marcus shifted his weight and stepped forward again, the pause ending as naturally as it had begun. Malik followed without hesitation, their steps falling back into sync as they moved past the park and into another stretch of city street, the lights ahead brighter again, the sound returning, steady, constant, a reminder that the world did not stop for any one moment. But that did not make the moment any less real. Malik glanced at Marcus briefly, then back ahead. "You think they will ever see it the way we do?" he asked, and Marcus gave a small, almost invisible shake of his head. "They do not need to," he said. "They just need to see enough to question what they thought they knew." Malik let out a quiet breath, something between agreement and understanding, and the conversation settled into silence again, not empty, but complete, the kind of silence that came when nothing more needed to be said. They reached another intersection, the light above turning from red to green in a steady cycle, and as they crossed, the glow washed over them briefly, illuminating their faces before fading again into the dim of the next block. Marcus adjusted his jacket slightly, the fabric shifting over the hidden badge beneath, unseen, just like before, just like always, because what mattered was never what was shown first, it was what remained when everything else fell away. And as they continued down the street, the city unfolding ahead of them in quiet layers of light and shadow, there was no urgency in their steps, no need to chase what came next, only the steady understanding that whatever the next moment held, They would meet it the same way they always had, calm, aware, and ready to let it reveal itself when the time came. The city thinned as they moved farther from the brighter blocks, the lights more spaced out now, each one casting its own small circle of clarity before fading into shadow. Marcus and Malik walked without speaking, their steps steady, unhurried, the kind of pace that did not chase the night, but moved through it with quiet certainty. A breeze drifted down the street, carrying the faint scent of rain and asphalt, and for a moment it felt like everything had settled exactly where it needed to be. Not resolved, not finished, just understood. Marcus slowed near the edge of a quiet intersection where the traffic lights blinked on a late cycle, red turning to green with no cars waiting, no urgency, just a rhythm continuing on its own. Malik stopped beside him, glancing briefly up at the signal, then back down the empty road. "You ever think about how close it gets?" Malik said quietly, not tense, just reflective. Marcus kept his gaze forward, watching the light shift again. "Every time," he replied, and there was no weight of fear in it, only recognition, because closeness was part of the work, part of the space they moved through without needing to define it every time. Malik nodded once, his hands still in his jacket pockets, the fabric shifting slightly as he adjusted his stance. "And still," Malik added, "most people would never see it coming." Marcus let out a soft breath, almost a sigh, but lighter, more grounded. "That is because they are not looking for it," he said, and the words carried the same quiet truth that had followed them since the alley, the same thread connecting everything that had unfolded tonight. They stepped forward together as the light turned green again, crossing the empty street without breaking stride, their reflections stretching briefly across the damp pavement before fading back into shadow, and for a second, the silence between them felt complete, not needing anything more. But Marcus spoke again, softer now, almost like a thought spoken out loud. "It is not about catching the moment," he said. "It is about being ready when it finds you." Malik glanced at him, just for a second, then forward again, letting that settle, because it was not something you argued with. It was something you carried. They reached the far side of the street and continued on, the buildings growing quieter, the windows darker, the city slowly shifting into its late-night rhythm where fewer people moved, but those who did seemed more deliberate, more aware of their own presence. Marcus adjusted his jacket again, the hidden weight beneath it barely noticeable now. Just part of him, just part of how he moved through the world. Malik slowed half a step, then matched him again, their alignment instinctive, unspoken. "You think he is still standing there?" Malik asked after a moment, thinking back to the man under the neon light. Marcus did not turn, did not need to. "No," he said calmly. "He is moving." And there was something certain in that answer, not about direction, not about distance, but about change, because moments like that did not leave people where they found them. They shifted something, even if it was small, even if it took time to fully understand. Malik nodded slowly, accepting that, the night stretching ahead of them in quiet layers. And as they walked, the last of the distant sirens faded completely, replaced by the steady hum of a city that never fully slept. Marcus glanced once more down the street ahead, not searching, just aware, then continued forward without pause, his steps measured, grounded, present, and Malik followed beside him, their silhouettes blending into the rhythm of the streetlights as they moved farther into the night, leaving behind no trace except the quiet echo of a moment that had not changed the world, but had changed something real, something human, something that would carry forward long after the lights faded and the streets forgot. And that was enough. It had always been enough.